My colleagues, we are back from recess. Before we begin on chapter 2, page 10, I'd like to just remind my colleagues of the rules of engagement, just certain parts of it. Amendments must be proffered on the floor only after the clerk is in receipt of a Word version and the amendment is emailed to the clerk. So please make sure that you get your amendments in. And amendments to increase or to decrease, it's pay as you go. A reminder, if you want to identify funding from an agency to be taken from that agency, and you have to identify the agency it's going to go to. All right? And vice versa. You take it away from them. With that, Vice Speaker, we have the Department of Education folks are here. They've all been sworn in. We have the Superintendent, Mr. John Fernandez and his staff, and we also have the deputies in the public hearing room if you need. All right. So, if you want to start, ma'am.
Mr. Chair, thank you so much, and thank you for your patience, Mr. Chair. I'd like to thank Mr. Superintendent John Fernandez and members of DOE for their support in being here today. We're reviewing the budget, and so some of my colleagues have some questions for you. One of the largest concerns was the Simon Sanchez appropriation request for $5 million. You don't see that here really, and I believe the last time we were in correspondence, there was about $32,000 that was spent, and that's the latest update that we have. So perhaps you can talk a little bit about that, where we are going with the Simon Sanchez procurement, your way ahead. And then also there were some concerns about the split of the charter schools from DOE. So maybe you can talk about our discussions on how that will impact DOE, whether it's a positive thing or a negative thing, and as we move forward. And then I'm sure that my colleagues will have questions after that. Thank you, Mr. Superintendent.
Does any of my colleagues have any questions for the superintendent? You're going to, okay, right after that. Go ahead.
Thank you, Vice Speaker, Senators. With regard to the Simon Sanchez High School renovation that's underway, we were able to issue a Phase 1 bid for services to complete land surveying services for the school, and I believe we're just waiting for the final survey documents from our contractor. So that was Phase 1. We were able to do that with the funding made available, and our expectation was to be done sometime during the summer, and so they are on target with that phase. Phase 2 is supposed to be the architectural and engineering, well, basically the design process. So as you recall, we worked to divide the project into phases. What that meant was, instead of doing one design build contract for one vendor to do the entire project, what we wanted to do, because of the protests that were going on and with the shift of responsibility, we did ask the legislature for flexibility to deal with these with the procurement, hopefully to generate more competition and to address some of these procurement concerns. So our Phase 2 involves the architect and engineering services. Now, the challenge of going away from design build is that you have to look for funding to fund the pre-development phases, and that has been something that I know the legislature's tried to address, and we're currently working with the administration as well to try to close what is still a gap in funding. So we anticipate, based on the budget, based on the revenues that have been dedicated to the project, that it's going to cost between $4 to $6 million for the design work. Obviously, if we can get it for less, than we would, but that's the estimate that we're trying to certify is available. I think with all of our efforts, we've been able to try to piece together $1 to $2 million, but there's still a gap. And again, we're working with GITA, we're working with the front office, and I know we've discussed it with the senators about just trying to find that funding so we can move ahead with the design phase. Once that design phase happens, it's going to be good news for the school to be able to participate openly as the school community with the design firm to really carve out what it is that needs to be done to bring that school to reality. But that's still the remaining piece is funding. We are looking at and working with GITA on a potential Plan B if funding does not materialize, but that's something that is still in the works. So our priority is to try to get that started, within these first couple months of the school year. So again, phase 2, land survey is done. Phase 2 is architect and engineering. And then after that, once we get the design work done, which we had hoped to get done sometime in the spring semester of next year, if we work on that time frame, then we'd be able to go out to bid out the financing and construction, and hopefully by the summer, look at breaking ground on a new facility. So it's an ambitious time frame, and we just need to pull the pieces together, and we'll continue to work with you and the front office on that effort. Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Superintendent. In one of the letters that you wrote, and thank you for breaking it down for us, you identified the appropriation source specifically for Simon Sanchez. And so we have Public Law 34-29, which was appropriated $150,000, and then Public Law 34-26, which was appropriated $430,000. Public Law 34-117, which was appropriated $1.5 million, and Public Law 34-116, which is appropriated $1 million. In this spreadsheet this chart, there's 0 encumbrance and 0 expenditures for the Public Law 34-116 of $1 million, so none of that was spent, and Public Law 34-117 for $1.5 million.
Correct.
Can you just explain why that was not utilized at all, or was it because
correct.
you did not receive the allotment?
Okay, so I believe the 1.5 is associated with the tax amnesty effort. And so my understanding was that the government had to meet a certain threshold in terms of tax amnesty collections in order for the funding to be made available to, over that threshold to GDOE. So in our communications with DOA and BBMR, that threshold was not met. Therefore, we are not to expect the $1.5 million from that source of funding. The additional the $1 million, I don't believe there's cash right now for the $1 million. However, we were hoping to see if it's possible and I know we had asked to roll that over as a continuing appropriation so that we can, in this fiscal year, see if we can continue to bridge the gap. We believe that there may be a $1.5 million from those sources available, with the legislature support, but that'll leave us, $2.5 to $3 million. I mean, $3 to $3.5 million to try to close in order to fund the next phase.
So in the phases that you listed, phase 1 was the pre-development phase, and that involves the land surveying services.
Correct.
And that was completed or submitted by January 11, 2019.
Right.
And
So
what
that
was-
should be complete, and that we were able to secure those services for less than $100,000. So that's
Okay.
helped.
So do you know the cost in the front?
We thought it was going to, I don't know exactly, but we had thought it would be a couple $100,000 at least.
Okay.
So I think with the technology, new technology being added to surveying practices, they were able to do so and cut costs.
And then you have the owner agent engineer services. Where
Right.
were you at on that?
So that is, we were hoping to build that into the design phase piece. So it would be one vendor doing
Right.
both of those pieces. And basically, the OAE work is a contract, basically a consultant to come on in and give us advice with regard to the final specs, the procurement packages that we're putting together as part of this process. So they would come in on the pre-development side, and then they would help to oversee the execution of the procurement going forward.
So in the status, you listed RFP scope of services has been developed and is pending issuance based on the remaining balance of funding identified by Public Law 34-116 and Public Law 34-117.
If I could, so one of the reasons why we're trying to bundle some of those steps is because it won't help us to bring the consultant on board with no further, with no design process in place, or, and definitely prior to the construction happening, it won't make sense for them to be consulting when there's no other party brought to bear. So we are looking at bringing them on, but we need to make sure the other critical phases, which is the design and then the financing construction, that those are able to move forward as well. So the 1 million and the 1.5, that we appreciate and support, if we get the remaining gap, we can then push out and certify funding availability for the next major phase.
So what we are looking at is the Public Law 34-117 from the amnesty
Right.
that we need to fulfill. But you should have that 1 million from 34-116. And so we're just looking to see how
Right.
much of the amnesty you didn't receive.
So nothing from the amnesty.
Nothing from the amnesty.
And I believe the 1 million, it's not that it's not been approved or made available, it's just that it's only a portion of what we need for
Right.
the A&E work.
So you do have that 1 million from 1
It expires at the end of the fiscal year, so we were looking at the possibility of
over.
either carrying over or having to make that gap up next year.
Okay. And just for our awareness, this money will roll over back into DOE's fund, right? Because the governor is not allowed to really touch any of DOE's money, or do you need us to do a prior year obligation for this to ensure that DOE gets this money from this law?
I think we would need a continuing operation language in the Appropriations Act.
Okay. And then the architectural and engineering services, so you want to combine the owner agent engineer services with the architectural and engineering services. So it's basically the design together,
Right.
which was the scope of services. In the status we reported, scope of services has been developed and is pending identification of funding.
Correct. So the bulk of that, of course, again, is the design. So, if we're using industry averages, we're talking about 5 to 10% of total project cost. So that's why we're looking at that, the 4 to 6 million, 3 to 6 million dollars is what we're looking at as a range. And then based on what comes available and how it's made available, we can proceed from there. The the owner agent engineering consultant, we don't expect that to be a significant cost and probably can be absorbed within that, the architecture and engineering set aside. So if we identify funding in that range, we think the OAE will maybe come in between 100 and 200,000 at the most.
Okay. So we're looking for finding a way to see if we can meet at least the $3 million mark.
We need to be able to certify funding availability, so yes. And then we're not able to project what will be bid for it. We can only estimate it at this time, but if they come in lower than that, then it'd be great. If they come in higher than that, then we'll have to find a way to deal with that.
Okay. And there's also concern about some of the costs and in the manner that you require funding to actually build and develop Simon Sanchez High School. So can you please just give us the options that DOE has come up with for additional financing for
Sure.
the build-out? And really the cost continue, as we move forward in the years, the cost keeps on going up. Now we're looking at like $100 million.
Well, no, I think the issue, three issues.
Okay.
So with regard to all the work we're trying to do to provide this pre-development funding, I wanted you to be, the legislature to be aware that we're currently working with the U.S. Department of Agriculture to secure long-term financing on this project. And that's something that we're working on with GITA very actively right now and with USDA. Now, while that does not relieve us of having to find the upfront funding, because of the fact that it's a cost that can be rolled into that long-term financing. At the end of the day, if we're successful with the USDA long-term financing application, those funds will then be basically be able to be reimbursed or repaid because they will be able to be taken out from the long-term financing agreement. So that's a good news if we're able to make these pieces work. I think with regard to other options, this applies this applies to the pre-development work. At the public hearing that we had when the discussion was made to transfer the responsibility from DPW to DOE, in addition to the department asking for more flexibility, we do know that there were potential witnesses who came forward to testify, and I'm sure that the committee has the testimony, to look at ways in which the work can be pre-funded and then basically reimbursed from the proceeds that would happen after the lease is executed. So while that's something that's a little bit more complex and we'd have to make sure we do our due diligence, I just want to say, I'll say for the record because it was made public, that there were potential offerers saying that, if we came in, there's a potential for us to fund the design work, for us to not compete for the construction work so that there isn't a conflict, and then structure it so that we get reimbursed when the project is fully financed on the back end. So that's with regard to this pre-development work. And then with the construction piece, the public statute already takes care of that. That's going to be funded through municipal lease arrangement. So that'll be similar at that stage to JFK, Ukadu, and the lease schools, wherein the developer fully finances the construction of the facility, and then we basically lease that facility back for an amount that's set forth and capped in statute over a period of time until it's fully paid, and then it reverts back to the ownership of the government. So I think we're okay with that part of it because that's already fully thought through and set forth in the public law. It's finding the pre-development work and then approving. At the end of the day, we'd have to probably come back to the legislature to approve. I believe if there may be opportunities to approve or review the long-term financing piece.
Thank you, Mr. Superintendent. So one item that we need to ensure is that we give you the continuing appropriation authority within this budget bill for that $1 million that has not been spent, and then see if we can move forward as the end of the fiscal year approaches to see if we could get you the additional appropriation for the funding services of the OE&E and the architectural and design.
Right, so my understanding is there's $500,000 set forth in this appropriations bill, and then the $1 million that in the 19 would expire.
Right.
So if there's any way to continue that, then it'll get us $1.5 million towards closing the gap.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Superintendent. Mr. Chair, thank you. If my colleagues have any questions.
Mr. Chair, if I may, just a further verification based on what he just said. So is there an you talked about the 500,000 and then the million, and then you said something to the effect of needing of authorization from us. Can you further define that, sir, please?
No, what we're saying is at this point, we're looking at phase 2, which is can we get the design work going? And as far as that cost estimate, we're looking at that being between the $3 to $6 million range, based on a 5 to 10% of total project cost. So we only have, if we could get continuing appropriation authority for $1 million plus the 500,000 that's in the current bill, that'll give us a 1.5, and then we would just need that additional 1.5 to $3 million to close that gap. And we're working with Gita and the administration to try to find that amount, but 1.5 would definitely help us along the way.
And that would be the last component needed to be able to effectuate this facility finally getting built.
It'll definitely get us to complete the design, and then the construction, we would have to come back for the full execution of the lease arrangement, but that's already set forth in law, and that's already been done in, with prior schools. So basically what we would do is execute a lease agreement between the government and the developer, and then a lease back agreement where we commit to paying over the 25 years and then reverting back to the government. But that's something we've already done, so I think, and it's already authorized in statute that's reflective of prior laws. So I think that part, once we get to that part, working with Gita and the legislature, we can execute that smoothly. It just means that we'll finally have to pledge the amount for the lease payment, and that pledge will then take effect once the legislature approves. But right now, we don't have that ability to pledge those revenues until we get to a developer who's going to execute that lease.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Fernandez.
Okay, what is it? Okay, I didn't see that one. So that 1.5, so 1.1
So-
and 5 is good, yeah.
Mr. Chair, so just wanting to verify that the information provided by Mr. Fernandez, if there is further authorization needed or we need to amend from this August body, if it's not already written based on the sections, then I'll go ahead and wait. I wanted to ask Mr. Chair, are we going to go section by section on the questions, or between the whole chapter 2, can we ask any questions?
We're going to go over the whole chapter, and just to answer your question, on page 11, and I've showed this to the superintendent, on line 5 or line 4, unexpended fiscal year 2018-2019 appropriations from the general fund shall not lapse and shall be available for the intended purpose of the appropriating the sec. In other words, he will have access to 1.5, so he only needs an additional 1.5 like he stated earlier. So that's something we have to find separately. It's on page 11 on the Budget Act. Page
So-
11 of chapter, well, page 11 period.
So with all due respect, Mr. Chair, so I'm going to ask again, are we going to go, so section 2 was about Simon Sanchez?
That's correct.
And the good oversight chair had asked pertinent questions, so I want to ask, are we going to go section by section? Or are we open to anything? Because,
What I'm hoping to do is we're going to cover chapter 2 of DOE.
and we can speak
And we're
on
just
it.
going to cover DOE in general. The oversight chair is asking questions, and I just wanted to identify that on page 11, the
Okay.
question that was asked, it's in the budget. I just showed it to him. He's come to of it now. Now he's just hoping to see if we can find 1.5 to close the loop for Simon Sanchez. And so we're going to cover the whole chapter one time for DOE.
So then if I may, Mr. Chair?
Yes.
On section number 3, on Chamorro Studies Division, I know that we're looking at $540,545 to go into the Chamorro Studies Division, and this would be for personnel, salaries, benefits, contractual, and professional development, training, supplies, and materials. And it also notes that besides the equipment and support and the implementation of the content standards and performance indicators for the course syllabus, for the emphasis and the fluency of the promotion and proficiency of the skills in this area of Chamorro, from speaking, reading, writing, all in the Chamorro language. If the good director can share with me the successes on section 3 and the implementation of what has just started at, I understand, at PC Lahan. And what is it going to take to make sure that we have the necessary teachers and the equipment necessary for this, but more importantly, has DOE ascertained any grant fundings moving forward to truly bring to full fruition the implementation of making sure that our language and our identity is preserved and advocated for?
Great. So thank you, Senator. The program at PC Lohan, Madam Speaker, is the Chamorro Immersion Program that we just started this year. It's a pilot program that we're doing in partnership with Chief Harao Academy. And right now we're expanding into kindergarten, and that requires that we have 2 teachers and 2 instructional aides, as well as some school staff just to help supervise in a particular wing at PC Lohan. So our effort, and then of course Chief Harrao is running its pre-K program. So we worked it out to be able to open up with a very smooth transition into this program. And then the intent is that every year there should be growth in that program. So you're absolutely right to flag this the program. It wasn't incorporated into the original request. In fact, what we're looking to do right now as a pilot program is utilize federal funding to try to supplement what's currently going on right now. So that is, may help to boost the availability of resources for the immersion program. And so I think down the road we will need to look at the hiring of teachers, and if it merits additional teachers, that will become a local cost because we can't get federal funding for those costs. But as far as supplies and materials, for now we're looking at the consolidated grant as a source. And of course we're working in conjunction with Chief Harrao and their ability to raise funds. And then also, as you know, there's a language revitalization partnership at on Building E at Teason campus that is launching this year as well. So we're just, that's with the Commission and other partners. So right now there isn't any local funding in addition to what's being set forth to support the program, but we're hoping that as we grow the program, there will be that level of support in conjunction with our federal grant resources.
And thank you very much, Mr. Fernandez. I wanted to ensure that based on the implementation moving forward and the public-private partnerships that you have with Chief Harrao, I'm hoping that we can make sure that the identified resources or what we can tap into and as far as federal grants, maybe even looking at opportunities with those who've shared interests, the foundations who've shared interests like the National Science Foundation, making sure that all gets included into the equation, but more important that there is a dedicated funding source from what is being provided today, because I'm sure that that this is one of the crucial steps in making sure that
Right.
that our language is preserved and that we continue to advocate for who we are as island people, as Chamorros, but more importantly, keeping our language alive. And you talked about that revitalization and working the concepts with the facilities you have in Teason, but I have not seen any further plans, and I think it's really important and really key. So I was hoping that you can expound on that.
Well, so what's going to happen is we have to solidify these agreements. There are two pending memoranda of understanding that have to be signed off. But currently, so there is some final documentation that needs to be signed off to move forward. I know that the Commission has identified resources that it may need to support its function and role as part of the Revitalization Commission. I think for GDOE, our primary focus will be the growth of our immersion program and the staffing needed to support. So it's a good time to flag that because we'll enter the next school year next August, and so we'll have to figure out how to bridge into the following fiscal year. But for now, I think we'll be okay getting through this pilot year, and I appreciate your attention. Hopefully over the course of this year we'll develop a better funding plan for the long-term growth. But I think this summer we were just worried about making sure that we connected the dots, got the teachers in place, materials in place, facilities ready, and then solidified the MOUs, and then that'll help give us a guide for the next year.
Mr. Fernandez, and thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Senator Castro, and then you'll be followed by Senator Torres.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First of all, just as a point of information, I want to thank you for the rule you set forth in terms of entertaining the entire chapter, remaining, especially given the fluidity of the conversation and your pay-as-you-go rule. But I do want to state for the record, Mr. Chairman, that's a departure from the previous discussion in the previous chapter when you ruled out my colleague. While I don't...
Point of order, Mr. Chair.
Vice Speaker.
Mr. Chair, the discussion here is to ask Mr. Superintendent questions. Please, can
Point
you,
of order,
can we please
Mr.
stay
Chair. Point
focused
of
on
order,
that?
Mr. Chair. Can we have the previous speakers finish the sentence he's trying to make before you want to put a point of order? And just out of respect to the colleagues here on this floor, Mr. Chair, and I would hope that you would also
Mr. Chair, I have
make
the
her
floor.
out of order.
Thank you.
So
And
Senators-
there have been members of this.
Joe.
So I
Let-
appreciate
I have a
if we
question,
can
I have a question.
hear the other speakers
Hold
speak
hold on, Senator Tello.
for interrupting.
We're discussing the Department of Education. If any of my colleagues have questions for the Department of Education, please feel free to raise your hand and make your statement. If you want to talk about anything prior, it will not be entertained. So, Senator Castro, do you have any question
I do,
for
Mr.
the
Chairman.
Superintendent of Department of Education?
I sure do.
Let's move forward. Thank you.
I was hoping that I didn't have to raise a point of order on your previous statement, but I'll go ahead and move on with my questions, okay? Just want to state that for the record. I have a couple questions, although I did have a sidebar conversation with the Oversight Chair in the event I can't get the supporting document. In the prior budget bill, Mr. Chairman, there was a provision within the bill that became law that allowed GDOE to use unexpended, unencumbered funds for the Simon Sanchez project for operations. Now, I just wanted restated for the record, as I thought I heard it, that none of those monies, unexpended, unencumbered for FY19, were in fact used for operations.
We have not received that funding, so that's the issue, has not been used for operations. However, we are still currently working with the front office to ensure that we have sufficient cash to get through the rest of the year. So that's my understanding.
Okay, so they did not receive the cash allotment for that specific provision of the Public Law, Section 30, page 13 of Public Law 34-116. So, safe to assume, obviously, they haven't used it for operation. Maybe my question is, do you intend to use it for operations given the authorization by Public Law 34-116 for the remaining of the fiscal year?
I would say currently we don't have plans to use that funding if made available, if we don't have to. At this point, I will inform the legislature we are working to ensure that we have sufficient funding to get through the rest of the fiscal year. We have received assurances from the Department of Administration and BBMR that our general fund appropriations will be fully funded for this fiscal year. We are still discussing the $2.1 million in TEF that has resulted from the fact of the undercollection of TEF revenues. So that's a continuing discussion, and that's all that kind of remains on the table for us to resolve.
So, Mr. Chairman, I appreciate the efforts of the department during our austerity period to have cut $18.5 million. It was a major point of contention and anxiety for many members of this community. I wasn't clear on his response, but I'm going to assume, Mr. Chairman, that there is no intention to use, should the cash be allotted for the purposes of fulfilling Section 3 of the prior bill, which became Public Law 34-116 for operations. Mr. Superintendent, you don't need to respond. I'm satisfied. I'm just stating it for the record that that's my understanding, given the department's posture this afternoon. I do have a question for the department, Mr. Superintendent, and that's why I asked for a bookmark. I can't find it, and I usually like to have something in writing in front of me so I have a basis of fact from which to ask my question, but perhaps you can help me. I just can't recall, but I'm of the understanding that there's a requirement also in public law that a capital improvement plan be established by the department as part of this Simon Sanchez funding initiative. Is that a correct statement or assumption?
So you're absolutely correct that there was the intention and a statutory language that says that a capital improvement plan should be done as part of the projects funded by the revenue source set aside for Simon Sanchez. Subsequently, there was legislation passed to restrict or to separate the funding streams that were first identified and to require that Simon Sanchez High School renovation be done first. And so for that reason, we're proceeding with that project, and then upon completion of that project, we'll hopefully be able to access available funding that might still be there for the facilities planning.
Thank you. You know what, I really appreciate that, Mr. Superintendent. With that said, Mr. Chairman, if the assumption then, in good faith, that the administration, the Leon Guerrero Tenora administration, is going to go ahead and release the cash allotment for DOE to fulfill its FY19 requirements as passed by this body, then it would also be safe to assume that that would carry over in the current budget bill. So I'd like to reserve my time to craft some language that may allocate a portion of that for the purposes of fulfilling a CIP, a master plan of some sort. It makes total sense to me, Mr. Chairman and Mr. Superintendent, that if we were to do that, you'd have professionals out there in the field, boots on the ground, to be in a position to best determine what the needs of the department are in terms of physical facilities and in the context of a growing charter school community. And so I appreciate that, and Mr. Chairman, I just want to state that for the record, that it's so important to have a strategic direction, which I will have a series of questions later about in terms of the overall academic direction of the department and also of the territory. I would assume as the chief instrumentality of public education for K through 12 for the people of Guam, that the board and yourself and your senior leadership would have a good idea what it is we hope to get out of our children once they matriculate, once they finish, once they persist through the system and graduate. And so in addition to a strategic plan, I'm honing specifically my questions that's relevant to this section of the bill, Mr. Chairman, as it relates to physical facilities. So thank you both. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Senator Castro. If you do proffer an amendment and we're done with education on Department of Education and it relates to them, you can also ask to have that added on the miscellaneous portion because it deals with CIP. Thank you, Senator Castro. Senator Torres?
Good morning. My question is with regard to the First Generation Trust Fund initiative. I noticed in this year's Budget Act, there isn't an appropriation for that as there was in the prior public law for fiscal year 2019. And my question is, are you aware of what the balance of that fund is presently?
So I would say prior to this summer, it was probably around $600,000 from prior years of setting forth of paying into the First Generation Trust Fund.
And this includes the appropriations that were given from the other sources, correct?
It does, although not the other, and you're talking about GCC and UOG have not been able to fully meet their obligation. So a lot of that has come from DOE itself as part of the statutory requirement.
What I'm wondering is this clearly is a lot of money that could be directed if the will is to consider whether there are other priority needs for that money at this present time. In your opinion, I don't mean to put you on the spot, but is that something that DOE might be open to utilize? Because I know that the other sources are also strapped with making their contributions annually. And has the program really stood up to date in terms of awarding?
So this is the first year that this has been made available. So
Okay.
over the years, we've been collecting it to be implemented for this graduating class. So that's something that's currently in process. We've worked with UOG and GCC to try to make the process smooth, and we'll come together after registration is over and try to make sure we work out any kinks that exist. I think the challenge has been, yes, definitely you've identified some of the cash situations where I know GCC and UOG have communicated with us that due to their cash shortage, they've been unable to pay into the trust fund. So most of what is being paid into it is from GDOE. At the same time, it begs the question, since the university and the college are receiving these students and the funding is going to support access to services at GCC and UOG, it begs the question as to whether GDOE should be funding that particular project versus the post-secondary institutions themselves, since it benefits them in terms of hopefully a greater enrollment. But that's a discussion I'm sure we'd be happy to figure out. But we have been paying into that fund.
Okay, because that actually is, I think, a very valid question, maybe not for this budget cycle, but maybe immediately after because just in looking at Section 17, the appropriations for the school grounds maintenance, we know that that's a critical area. We know that Simon Sanchez, another area here, is a critical area. We also know that the charter schools is another critical in-need area. So I just want to pick your brain on that, sir, and thank you for...
Yeah. If I could just clarify my position, I do think it's beneficial to provide support for first-time college-going students. How we do it and who's responsible, whether cash is available. Hopefully we'll learn from this summer as to how many students are able to take advantage of that and how much it costs, and then maybe use that information to plan how to improve that program.
Yes, I understand. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Senator. Senator Perez, you have a question?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. So, Superintendent John Fernandez, so you'd mentioned earlier that Public Law 34117 was supposed to be funded using tax amnesty fees, and I'm looking at the bill, and it doesn't mention anything about reaching a certain target. Can you just provide an explanation of what DOA was expecting, or what was the arrangement that was made regarding that?
I would have to review that, go back and re-review the law, but that's been our conversation with the representatives of BBMR and DOA. So I can go and review that and try to come back with a response. But it's our understanding that there was a certain threshold of collections. I'm not sure how that threshold is supposed to work, but when we did make a request for those funds, we were told that since it didn't meet that threshold, no funding is going to be made available to any of the entities that were supposed to receive funding. So that's my recollection of our guidance.
Okay, so I would probably also look into that as well as Oversight Chair of Revenue and Taxation. Also, I just remember in my stint as a teacher at Simon Sanchez High School, we actually were provided with plans of the school. There were 3 options. And I'm just wondering why it seems like we're going backward, where there was, it appeared to us that there was already a design in place. And I'm just wondering what happened to those designs.
So all I can say is that during the prior procurement phases, I don't know if it was part of the prior procurement phases, but I know that when the Department of Public Works went out to solicit through an RFP, we did get some conceptual designs that were there, but but as far as the RFP goes, it's first you're supposed to qualify the offers and then award based on the highest qualified offerer, and then what was supposed to happen once the contract was executed, finalize the details of the design. So I'm not really clear on which you might have seen, but if it was part of the sharing of those conceptual designs, those were just conceptual, and we didn't have much more detail than that. So we're trying to get further than that, and actually we're trying to tighten up what exactly the school community wants, so we don't have to look at 3 different concepts, but go ahead and move forward with one concept that the student community or the school community can agree on.
Okay, thank you. It just looks like, I appreciate, it seems like we have a clear path of what needs to be done, and I think it's pretty achievable at this stage. All right, thank you.
Thank you, Senator Perez. Does any of my colleagues have any questions for the Department of Education? We'll start with Senator Terlai.
First, to clarify, Mr. Chair, do you mean on this chapter? When we're done with these,
On
we're done with this
specifically
chapter?
the Department of Education.
Right.
Right. So do you have any questions for DOE?
Right. Okay, yes.
While the superintendent is here?
Well, I do on this chapter, yes. I mean, on this part, so. So as to DOE, okay, so regarding the Simon Sanchez, so the bill now does what you had asked to allow for that fund, the 1 million to carry over to be used for you, all right. And then I just wanted, I guess, to follow up on my colleague's question about, you said you're getting Gita's help for this, is Gita helping you to make an arrangement with USDA? Is that for the designs, or that's for the building construction, or what is that going to be for?
Okay, so Gita's assistance right now is with us, involved in the conversation with USDA. on the possibility of securing the long-term financing. So what that means is that for the construction, it's likely that we'll go out to the private, market for the short-term construction financing, and then the long-term loan, USDA will come in for the long-term financing. So they'll basically pay that loan and then take us out over, I think there's the possibility and the benefit of USDA is not only beneficial interest rates, but they're able to provide financing over a longer period. So, 40-year financing versus a 25-year.
No, that's excellent. So does that mean then that what you're going to use from that fund that's dedicated to pay the cost of construction or the lease back payments are instead going to be paying USDA, something like that?
So once that's all worked out, it would allow, so if you're able to get more favorable interest rates and longer term, it'll decrease the annual debt service payment. So if you've set aside, $10 million for a project, then obviously if you don't need all 10, that leaves, the extra remaining for maybe other projects.
That's what we're hoping.
Yeah,
right?
no, definitely, same here. So right now on the statute, if you're going to go with a typical leaseback, it's a 25-year term, and you're asking the developer to go out and get their best financing. So they're going to be, non-governmental financing is going to be probably at a higher rate.
Right.
But if we're able to get USDA at a lower rate and at 40 years instead of 25 years, that creates some opportunity for further capital improvements.
All right. So along that line, is there a budget that you're looking at for this project? Because I know we have dedicated a funding source, the legislatures before us had dedicated a funding source from the TEFF to pay for it, but they had lumped it before with all the other improvements to the other schools. And now that they've allowed you to use kind of whatever you need for Simon Sanchez, I'm wondering, do you have a budget on that? Are we hoping to end up with money, or is it looking like you're going to use it all?
So I'm hoping that we do have the ability to, to have extra resources available when we're all done. And maybe the financing piece is where we see it. Maybe when USDA comes in, then we'll see that we're not going to need as much money to pay for that project and be able to use that money for other projects. So what the legislation allowed us to do was to have more flexibility in how we executed the procurement. But Senator Ada had introduced and the legislature passed a previous law that basically separated the Simon Sanchez project and the funding source. So if you take that funding source and extrapolate from that dollar amount, which is about 5.5, I believe, every year, and you look at the different possible interest rate range, I think it looks like it looks like it would yield a $55 to $65 billion project. That is in line with the other projects such as Ukudu High School. However, the concern that we'll have, of course, with time going by, and then of course the labor situation, is trying to meet that target.
Right.
So I think the only thing we can do to try to address this proactively, and again, as we said, we're trying to identify a rough range of cost estimates for the A&E work, but we certainly don't want to get someone at the maximum amount. And we definitely want to use the A&E design to look at how the design is going to impact costs. So I would love to be able to, in the design process, have the discussion with the stakeholders as to some of those choices you have to make in order to be able to fully fund your project. But obviously, we're not going to be paying for, I don't know what people used to call it, the Cadillac version of the school if we don't have those resources. So I think the design, if we can get the design work done and then move into construction, when we bid out the construction work, there'll be one design that's fully fleshed out with the community and probably brought to 80-90% by the designer company. And then everyone who bids on it will know exactly what it is they're building, which is different from before when they came in with different concepts and different, as you recall, widely different cost estimates. We're hoping that the design process basically says, this is what you're going to go build, give us your best offer, and then hopefully that'll achieve some savings.
All right. Well, the last time that we talked about that, the design on this Simon Sanchez, one of the issues was we were told we had to go back to the beginning to even decide how many students you were going to estimate to fit in that school. And this was all after the bids had gone out and you had, the RFPs, and you had received responses. And then we were told we weren't even sure what's the capacity we're looking for. So I agree with, getting this input, but I think most of it has to come from DOE. I mean, if we're going to get it done in a quick way, as opposed to having a debate as to everything, DOE has to really lead. And I guess that's why I'm following up on, my colleague's question again, is that how long do you expect that part to take, that getting input and moving towards a design? Because really what you're getting what are your mandated specs? I hope you're not going to get input as to, how it should look, but just what do you need to put in this school versus what you already have in Ukudu? Because it was my understanding, you were happy with those other schools, either JFK or Ukudu, and especially with the Ukudu expansion. I hate to reinvent the wheel and make it take forever. So, I know you're also concerned about the timing of it, but it does seem to be a stretched out process, and I'm hoping you can just consolidate that and kind of lead it and get input where you need it, but where you don't need it, like capacity and all those other things. If you can use the old designs, let's just move.
Right. So I'm with you on that. And again, I would love to commit an earlier time frame. It's just that I'll be back here before the legislature if we missed that. But I do think that the estimates for typical A&E work is going to be 6 to 9 months. And so we're working on trying to see what we can do to have a design ready sometime before the summer so that we can start to bid out and secure the construction and financing piece, which we hope will be more straightforward. It's the funding of the design work that has to happen in order for us to move forward. And I agree with you, we're not going to start from scratch by saying, what does everybody want, and, without giving them some parameters. So there are requirements we have to meet. We just went through redistricting, so looking at the number of students that would need to be served at that school within reason, and then going out. And I don't believe we'll be in a discussion of saying, keep adding on, because the financing is already clear to us that what that potential cap will be. And given the fact that we know what other schools cost and the rising labor costs, the discussions may have to be more around, trade-offs between certain things that the school may want. So if you want a gym and a theater and all these other things, and if we're not able to fund that within our cost estimates, I think it's going to be worthwhile for us to make sure with the community that we have that discussion. So it may not be the same as, put together your dream school. It'll be probably the opposite of where are the priorities, so that when we finalize the design, it comes in at within the resources that have been made available.
When DOE was working with DPW for the prior procurement of this Simon Sanchez, it was design build, right? And so they had come up with designs already. That's what my colleague was talking about also. So, but what was the time period that they came up with their proposals for design build? It seemed like such a much shorter period.
Those were just conceptual designs. So they basically did mock layouts and mock exterior designs.
All right, so
I would say more of a marketing piece, just to show where they were thinking, what direction they would go. So what happened is we actually got a number of different designs that, on the face of those conceptual designs, resulted in a potential cost ranging between, I think, 65 to 100, maybe $90 million. And that ended up being discussed in the procurement protests about why those ranges were so disparate.
So high, right, all right. Okay.
So the design is, the other, just so I can note for the record, because I know you raised this issue, it is the proprietary nature of the design is also at issue.
Sure, for those proposals before.
So if a vendor did their design,
Yes.
are we able to take that and use it with another vendor? That's an issue we'd have to be careful about.
All right. Moving on to Section 3, Chamorro Studies Division. So you said that this $540,000 is going to be allocated now for this immersion program?
No, that'll be our typical request to staff the division as is.
The Chamorro Studies Division,
right,
had a
we
prior.
Didn't, right, because we introduced this in January, and we did not essentially pull the trigger on implementing the pilot immersion as well as the Language Revitalization Center until later in the year. And so, as I mentioned to Speaker, we'll have to incorporate that into our next budget request should there be additional resources contemplated. Right now, the intent was, if we launch this, because these are basically pilot initiatives, they're not your core curriculum, that we would be able to access federal funds to supplement for the interim.
All right, and then on section 6 of the bill, it looks like a new section that wasn't in last year regarding the alternative dispute resolution mediation services, 50,000. I'm just curious for what, is this under, is this for like special education, or what is this for?
So, this is part of our safety discussion that we've been having with, with the governor's office, with the community, with our stakeholders. I think the general direction that we're trying to go is obviously there is a punitive side in working with, school safety, student safety. So if you violate a rule or you violate, commit some kind of crime, there is a consequence, and those areas definitely have to be strengthened and discussed. But we've been having more of a discussion about what to do to prevent students from going down that path into the correctional system, and looking at tools and strategies to try to address that need inside the system. So this is really meant as a start to try to, there are potential, partners in the community who provide this type of service. So it would allow us to access those services and pretty much earmark that money for trying to do a more broad-based approach to mediation and alternative dispute.
All right, and then the section 12, it talks about utilities reduction incentive. I know we've talked about this for years, but I just want to know, do you have results like that you could report just very quickly for, so we have some hope that this is actually working, this provision?
We have a lot of conversation, but I'm hoping we have light at the end of the tunnel. So right now we've been working with the new Attorney General to try to finalize the lease school solar provisions. Solar power purchase agreements. One of the challenges in the enabling statute that seemed to exempt the lease schools from procurement was that the language in the statute appears to make that exemption, but also in other sections require compliance with 5GCA. And I think as we've gone through working with the lawyers in the AG's office, it's that kind of confusion that we're trying to work through. So we presented a power purchase agreement, and then they'll come back and say, well, did your landlord, did they document quotes for the services and so forth? But that's a continued issue that we're hoping to finalize. We're in constant communication. And I know our Vice Speaker, Senator Nelson, just recently introduced legislation as well to provide us the opportunity to go forward with the non-lease schools. And this is with regard to, again, alternative energy purchasing.
But what about the program where they get to keep any energy savings that the principal accumulates?
So part of that, again, I think that's an issue of working towards the end of the year to determine where those savings will be. I'm not aware of any savings that have been made. I know that as we track, and we do provide the monthly energy usage as part of our reporting requirements, is that we, some months it's up, some months it's down, but in general, as we've implemented consumption reduction, we still see that the rate increases are hard to keep up with.
All right.
So we've kind of been, we've been monitoring that. I will also want to add that we've been working with GPA and a couple of, with some DOI funding at GW, Southern, and Carbolito Elementary to implement some demand side management issues. So they just recently installed LED lights for all the lighting at Southern High and GW, and then they did a pilot project at Carbolito to try to implement more energy of conservation measures on the demand side, and we're waiting for the results of that to see if that's worth pursuing with further funding opportunities.
All right, thanks. And then at the end of the bill, the end of the DOE section is the new provision for school grounds maintenance. So they're bringing that back to DOE again after transferring it to the mayors. And I just wanted to know, you are okay with that? That's something you're willing to manage?
So if I could, just one more comment on the solar is that
sure.
With the legislation that I hope will have a public hearing and we'll be able to move through quickly, that may be the potential for us to go out from DOE instead of GSA, which currently has it, DOE to go out and engage and solicit for solar power. And I think at that point we might be able to see some more immediate savings but we're unable to go solicit for that from for our non-lease schools at this point until the law changes. So we're hopeful for that to pass. The second issue with regard to the grounds maintenance, the only concern at this point is, I know it's gone back and forth and between the mayor's council last year saying that they didn't want to do it anymore, and then they want to do it. And again, our experience has really been almost mayor to mayor. Basically village to village, school to school, as to what the experience has been in ensuring the proper maintenance of our grounds. At this point, I'm willing to reassume that responsibility, and I say that not because all the administrators will be happy to hear that in all cases, but we all know that when there is a trouble with the grounds maintenance, we end up going to our PTOs and doing purchasing on our own. So we do have that ultimate responsibility. The concern I do have is that it appeared in the prior appropriations that an amount of the higher amount of about $437,000 was given to the mayors for this purpose. And my only concern is that as we transition these responsibilities back to DOE, our understanding was that around $437,000 was originally given. So we would like to see if that's possible to make sure that funding amount is aligned, especially given this transition year. We'll continue to work with the mayors during this, if it's a transition period that we have to go through. But, purchasing equipment, if we're going to do that, contracting out those items, we need to make sure that we have the resources to do that.
Thank you, Mr. Superintendent. Finally, Mr. Chair, I just want to note for the record that in another portion of the bill that we have in front of us is the parts about the T10 lease for DOE. And I just want to note, it's not put in the same part with this DOE appropriations, but that we are, looks like appropriating over $10 million for those T10 leases. So I just wanted to note that for the record while we're talking about DOE. Thank you, Mr.
All right,
Chair.
thank you. Senator Tello.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And thank you, Superintendent and your staff, for being here this morning. I'm happy that you're here. It provides us a lot of insight of what's going on, especially the update on Simon Sanchez. The only thing I have a question on is the amount of money it will cost. There are two phases, of course, the preparation for the building, the A&D and all that's involved prior to the construction, and then the construction itself. Can you give me those two figures on how much is it costing us, and then how much is it going to cost us to build this new school?
Okay, so the way I look at those cost estimates is this. There's about $5.5 million committed under the statute to support the Simon Sanchez project. So if you're looking at, right now the statute requires that it be a leaseback agreement for a term of 25 years. So a 25-year term, $5.5 million a year. If you extrapolate on the possible interest rates, you get about a $55 to $65 billion total cost for the project. So that would be the cost that you would assume all the pre-development work and so forth would be funded. It's just that we can't access those funds because those are subject to a lease agreement.
Right.
So what we're doing is, if you take a $55 to $65 million project, we're estimating some of the pre-development costs based on normal industry estimates. So if we look at 5 to 10% A&E costs, for 5 to 10% of total development costs, then we'll get a range of $3 to $6 million. And so that's how we derive those two numbers.
Okay, thank you so much for that. It's a little bit
Sure.
clearer for myself.
Okay.
So I appreciate all the work that you're doing at DOE with the resources that you have. But I have a couple questions here. One of them is how many students were enrolled? John, when did you become a superintendent? What year was that?
In 2012.
2012. And at that time when you became a superintendent, how many students were enrolled at that time? Probably
Between 30 to 31,000 students.
Okay. And today, how many students are enrolled?
About 29,600 students.
So that's almost 8,000 less students in your enrollment?
No, from 31. No, it's basically less than 31,000, but It's about maybe 1,200 students less. If you're looking at, depending, I got to go verify the 12 numbers, but
6, 5, 4, 4, yeah, about, how much again? 12?
I would say, anywhere between 1,000 to 1,500 students less, depending on, we'd have to go verify the enrollment numbers from 2012.
Okay, so you're saying from that time you came in, when the enrollment was at 31,000 students, and is now at 29,000, is that correct?
Right,
I
I'd have
just
to
wanna
verify the 2012 numbers, but yes, generally around that amount, so
How
about
many
1,400.
yeah. How many schools were up during that time you came in?
How many schools?
How many schools?
We have 41 schools.
And how many schools are there now?
41.
Still 41, okay. So there is a drop of only about 1,100, 1,200 students
So, right,
from that
so between
time.
1,000 and 1,500 students, I would say that we're, sorry, I feel like we're really
It's
loud, but
okay.
that's based on the September 30 official enrollment numbers that we have for this past school year. And I would attribute the decrease to that level from obviously an opening of the charter schools contributed to part of that. And then second of all, I have to wait till this year to see if there's an aberration. We had this diploma scandal going on this last year where we understand that maybe 300 students were fraudulently graduated from the Department of Education. And so we're trying to see if that was a blip on the enrollment numbers, if they left our system due to that situation.
Okay, thank you, John. Also, on JP Torres, is it still operational, and how many students do you have there at JP Torres?
So I believe registered now, we probably have about 175.
So the school is still operational?
It is, much of its funding comes from federal funds.
So if you were to move some of these students and, less than one school and incorporate them into like Southern High School, where there's definitely room for, and cut your costs there, would that federal funds be carry over?
Yes, so the federal funds don't support the utilities and so for some of your basic costs. So, but I think if you're referring to our plans for JP Torres, we opened up a central location for the Success Academy at our Teason location. That serves about 100 students, and then and that was to alleviate the need, the transportation issues associated with students as far as GIGO having to go to Santa Rita. So we have about 100 students there right on the Teason campus, Teason headquarters campus. The remainder of those Southern students who are attending JP Torres would go to that Santa Rita site for now. But the discussion right now is right along the lines of whether integration back into Southern High is a possibility. Although the reason we haven't done any of that is because we recently changed some of the administrators, but it is a discussion as to whether there's sufficient need for a facility, a separate facility for those remaining Southern students, or whether integration into the regular campus would be a good idea.
So that leads me to my next question, Mr. Fernandez, is what is your plan to maximize our dollars and provide adequate evaluation to our teachers?
Excuse me?
What are you doing to maximize the dollars that we have cost efficiently? You are finding ways to cut cost or to integrate, to make our dollars stretch a lot further. What are you doing for that?
So what I would note, maybe for the record, is over the past couple of years, and if we're counting the TEF issue right now, the department has been cost cutting. So we've cut down by about, I would say, over $19 million to get to this point where we are right now. That's about an 8% reduction in our 2018 appropriation. And so part of the cost cutting and cost reduction comes from the actions of the government of this legislature to reduce our funding level. In response to that, as you know, when we first realized there was a revenue problem for the government, we were very proactive, I believe, in trying to address those issues by freezing hiring at the central office and non-essential positions. We went back and renegotiated some of our critical contracts to try to achieve savings. We actually had to forego reclassifications for a certain period of time. We delayed further expansion of our pre-kindergarten program, something that we feel is really a missed opportunity to invest in early childhood education. We postponed the onboarding of substitute teachers for a quarter in order to bring them on October 1st, but to get through the rest of the fiscal year. We had to redirect some of our funds that are made available for particular purposes to close the operational gap. That includes funds from the Limited Gaming Fund, from Passport to Libraries, from Healthy Futures, and so forth. So that helped us proactively close the gap, and we did that very publicly when the revenue situation first hit. Now, we reduced our numbers by $12.2 million through that effort. When the FY19 appropriation came about, we were not held steady at that $12.2 million reduction. In fact, we were asked to eat an additional 2.5, I believe. So it came down to about $14-15 million less in our FY19 appropriation. And then with the TEF situation, being unable to collect fully on TEF, that brings us closer to $19 million short. So even with all of these measures, and again, this is short of furloughing and short of other things, which was a government-wide discussion. I think that we've done our best to try to still meet our mission, because as you recall, we have mandates in law that are set for us to meet. Yet we have had to do that with a rapid reduction in our budget.
Okay, thank you so much for that, Mr. Fernandez, for explaining those areas, and I hope you continue to find even other ways without jeopardizing the education of our children, cost-cutting measures, and any waste that's out there is eliminated and put into areas that are needed. I actually thought, Mr. Fernandez, and if you can double check too, but in 2012, I believe it was 33 students enrolled during that time in 2012, if I'm not mistaken. So it does have
We'll double check that number.
a few thousand students less today than we did back there in 2012.
I'll double check that number.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate that, Mr. Fernandez. And Mr. Fernandez, what is the conditions of the restrooms and safety of all the schools that are under your authority?
So, sorry, say that one more time.
What is the condition of the restrooms and the safety of our schools under your authority?
The restrooms are in massive need of significant renovation. I mean, most
How
of
are
our
you addressing that?
Well, I believe we're trying to do the best that we can within an operational budget that allows us to, let me just put it, I guess I'll put it this way with all due respect to everyone. The need for capital improvements is normally funded through a capital improvement borrowing from the government. And I mean, this means that your long-term investment in major projects can be funded over time and repaid over time, because the use of those facilities are going to take that same time period to be utilized. The problem is that the limitation on government borrowing is severe enough that we are unable to meet those capital improvement needs. So if we're being asked, especially in light of a $19 million budget reduction, to fund major capital improvements within our operating budget, it becomes a significant challenge, because you're basically able to band-aid projects, but without significant access to significant funding amounts, we're unable to do whole-scale renovations for bathroom facilities and other needs, canopies and so forth. We've been very lucky to have access to federal funds. We were able to access $5 million through the Department of Interior, which is enabling us to deal with some of the canopy issues. But short of the federal funding support, meeting your capital needs, and I think it was basically documented at $90 million in deferred maintenance. A lot of that is unable to be met without a source of funding. And so I know for the past couple of years, I've been asking our elected officials to help us figure out where we can get a dedicated source of funding for facilities that we can leverage to address some of these major issues, including not just Sanchez, which we're doing through basically an off-balance book, approach with these leasebacks, but to be able to fund GW and all the middle schools that have significant issues and so forth. So that's really the essence of our problem.
Mr. Fernandez, we have 41 schools, 40 schools, not including Simon Sanchez, that, we all are concerned about, but there are 40 other schools out there that have issues, safety issues, bathroom issues currently right now. And it's something I think, if you're asking the legislature for assistance, then you need to show us the assessment of these areas, these bathrooms that are considered not safe. I'm getting calls from parents who are saying that my child almost slipped and cut themselves because the tile was broken in the bathroom of that facility and could have cut herself. So I think, if you can, I'm asking you that if you can please get this assessment through on the issues of these restrooms and safety areas. I'm talking about critical, Mr. Fernandez. I'm not talking about someone getting wet because they get off the bus and they're going to their school and there's no awning there, that they get wet. I'm talking about real safety issues here. So if you
Absolutely.
can put one together, I appreciate it.
Well, absolutely. I think part of this, we'll be happy to do it, to give an assessment of those facilities. I'll have that, done within the next couple of weeks if we need to. But I know that every year when we come to the legislature in our appropriations request, we set aside funding. There's about $20 million in this request meant to address those broad needs across the school system. Now, this is $20 million that we might not have. It's $20 million that we normally would borrow and pay back over time as a capital funding project. But we're asked to address it right now. We're going to need to find money right now. So happy to provide those prior budget requests, including this one, as well as an assessment. If you need it visually, we'll be happy to provide that as well. But I don't want to deny, the truth of the matter. We're not providing enough funding for the facilities. There are ideas and ways to do it, and I would love to engage in that conversation.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Fernandez, for that. Another question I have, Mr. Fernandez, is the textbooks. I'm trying to put my head around this, but DOE provides textbooks to our students, but they also provide textbooks to private schools. They also provide textbooks to the private schools. So why is it that DOE is responsible to provide these textbooks to private schools? Do the private schools pay for it? However, no textbooks are provided to charter schools.
All I can say at this point is that we are in that discussion right now, trying to clarify, and maybe through maybe the legislature can help with that. But right now, in the review of how these textbook funds are supposed to operate, there's a couple things. One is the role of the board in approving the textbooks that are available to the schools. Number two is the flexibility for those funds to be used for instructional supplies and what those supplies really should be defined. How are they defined? And then the third thing is really has to do with the intention to fund public charter school textbooks through the same funding mechanism. It was our understanding that when the per pupil funding formula was designed, that was incorporated into that amount. And then second of all, that we know that the charter schools are currently and have been funding some of their textbooks through that process without complaint. So we were aware of one charter school in particular that raised the issue. We have our legal team working on it to see what really what this all means. But there is an area of ambiguity there as to how this is supposed to work in funding textbooks for charter schools. I don't know. I won't say how we're going to end up, deciding it. I'm just saying that currently, I know our auditors took a look at it, had one opinion. Their opinion from the audit side was that it probably shouldn't be incorporated as a funding source for charter schools without the board's approval. I'm having the legal section review that to give me a legal opinion, and we are engaged with the lawyers of a particular charter school who is challenging that interpretation. And hopefully, as you know, when lawyers get involved, they get to resolve things quickly. So. We're hopeful.
Thank you, Mr. Fernandez, but if, in your personal opinion, then, I mean, these textbooks are made for our students here and students that this legislature appropriates money for their education. We don't do that for private schools. They have their own funding. They pay a pretty hefty tuition, to send your kids to a private school, but charter schools is different, and don't you think that would be a priority in textbooks before it goes to a private school?
I think that that's probably is worth looking at the law to ensure that it's clear what the legislature intends to do with those expenditure of resources. I'm surprised because I'm not familiar with a lot of the things I wasn't familiar when I first got on board of the number of things that are funded for the private schools through public funding, but I'm sure that that's something that the legislature can work through as far as textbooks go. All I can say is that we are reviewing it. The lawyers are engaged from both sides to try to figure out ways to interpret the law and how it should be applied, and it may come back to the legislature for a resolution.
Okay, I thank you so much for that, and I will follow up with that one too as well. I think it's very important that we look into that. Next, Mr.
Senator,
Sure.
I just wanted to clarify, we did look back to 2012. It was 31,300.
31, it was?
In that area.
Okay,
So-
thank you so much for that clarification on that. I guess then the last thing, Mr. Chair, thank you for indulging me. I just have one last thing because I have an amendment. I don't know, Mr. Chairman, do we proffer our amendments now or now? Okay. So I have an amendment here. I'm going to need some of the clerks to make copies of this amendment to pass out.
So we'll take a quick recess
Thank
so
you,
we
I
can get it out.
appreciate it. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Perhaps,
Vice
Mr.
Speaker?
Chair, we don't have to recess. I have a point of information.
Okay.
Okay, so just so we can keep the dialogue going, so we move forward. The Territorial Education Facilities Fund also funds DOE, but that comes from a majority or comes from our taxpayers' dollars. And so this money that we appropriate to DOE can be used for textbooks. And in 17 GCA Chapter 4, it says subsection 4106 that in subsection C, the pro rata share for public schools and for private schools of the total budgetary allocation for textbooks for each school year shall be an equitable amount based upon the total enrollment of students in kindergarten through the 12th grade. Just because I think there's an equity, because if everyone's paying into taxes, yes, we also pay for government services, but there should be some areas where our taxpayers also, if they should select to send their child to a private school, should be supported by the taxes they pay as well. In that sense, I know we do the same thing with the school buses. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. So, while we're getting
Mr. Chair, a point of information, my disparity is not with the issue of the private school. It's just, it's a disparity between the two, between a private school and a charter school. That's my point I'm trying to make.
It's a charter school.
Yeah,
Yes.
it's a disparity between the two.
Well, the superintendent said they're working that out with
And
the
I
lawyers.
appreciate that.
We'll wait for that to
Okay.
be resolved,
Thank you
and
so
then we'll
much.
address it then. But I understand where
Right.
the vice speaker is coming from, because generally, taxpayers are paying for textbooks, are paying the taxes. Everybody should get it. I think we'll just allow the superintendent to settle whatever they need to settle with their lawyers and the charter schools, and as soon as they get settled, then they can move on.
Right.
They'll
And,
address it.
and just a point of information, Mr.
Yes.
Chair, I do have an amendment that is inclusive of charter schools for the books, which
So
was
when-
it, yes.
When we get there, when we get to charter
Thank you,
school.
Mr. Chair.
So we'll take a very quick recess while we get those amendments out.
Yeah, I know.
My colleagues, we have returned from recess. Senator Tello, you have an amendment that you have
Yes.
circulated?
Yes, I do, Mr.
If you
Chair.
could please speak on it, and then maybe the superintendent will comment.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, but
Thank
if
you.
you could just indulge me, there was one last question I wanted to ask Superintendent Fernandez, and that was on page 12, section 6. This is something that wasn't in the FY19 budget, and I just wanted to know what this $50,000 is for.
Didn't you discuss that?
I know that Senator Terlahi raised the same question. It had to do with being able to avail ourselves of services in the community to support alternative dispute and mediation as a more positive way of resolving issues at the school as part of our school and student safety initiatives. So typically what happens is when we deal with discipline, kids end up getting suspended. If it's a criminal act, that obviously we have a lot of procedures and rules for them being dealt with in the judicial system. But what we're trying to do is promote more positive behavior and opportunities within the schools to deal with conflict in different ways. So we know there are services that are provided throughout this community in this area, alternative dispute and mediation, and we'd like to be able to advance that as part of our efforts in our schools.
Doesn't the Attorney General, they assist with something like this?
This is more in depth. This would be more in depth and kind of building the infrastructure in schools to address the situation. This wouldn't involve any legal matters, but I think what we're talking about is, I think one of the models we would talk about is developing teen courts within the school system that would take some training and some assistance in setting up in our high schools and our middle schools. So we thought this would just be a start to help us, avail ourselves of some of those services and prepare us for, future interventions such as this.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Fernandez, for that. Though I think this money could be spent in an area that maybe in capital improvements, like our bathrooms or safety of our schools. So I may be proffering an amendment for this money to be reverted to something like that. I think that's more important, the safety of our children. But Mr. Chair, I'll get back to my amendment that I proffered that all the senators have in front of them. This amendment, Mr. Chair, is just simply restoring what was put in your first budget bill that was put out before this one. And, Mr. Chair, when I saw that where it incorporated the cost per school, I thought this was a great idea. This way, these schools are able to see exactly how much money has been allotted to them, appropriated to them. And in the event, now this, Mr. Chair, does not stop Central from still holding the purse strings and having this money under their eye and their accountants to oversee this. But now it allows the principals, which I hear, Mr. Chair, is an issue when it comes to if they lose a staff, if they lose a teacher, if they need someone else for the school, that they know they have the money and they can simply just say, Superintendent, I lost several employees right now and I'd like to replace them. And and it's just as much as, keeping tabs as we do on our checkbooks, and how much we spend. So this principal, again, can come back and say, I know I do have some money in my account that allow me to hire this individual. And Mr. Chair, I think that this also makes it easier enough that we can eyeball this and see that in the event this school, which is appropriated, for example, JQ San Miguel, which is given $3,871,600, by the end of the fiscal year, we find out that JQ San Miguel only needed 2,871,000, or vice versa, Mr. Chair. Let's say that JQ actually needed 4,871,000 for some reason. Now, it doesn't stop the superintendent from utilizing some of the funds at Central to give to JQ San Miguel, or maybe see that another school is not tracking the expenditures that was appropriated to them, in fact, lower, that it can be transferred over to JQ San Miguel instead, or to Muning Elementary. But Mr. Chair, one thing for sure, 93,347,749 is the amount that will be going directly to these schools. It's spelled out here, Mr. Chair, and I think it's important, but not only on an accounting perspective to eyeball this, but you know, there are parents out there that keep tabs of what happens to their kids at school. So if Mrs. Cruz, who has a daughter going to Agana Heights Elementary, sees that 2.8,669,701 is going to that school, she might want to keep tabs on that to ensure that school is given that money and it's not diverted anywhere else. So, Mr. Chair, I greatly appreciate the public hearing that you had on this when this first came out, and it received support. The first time this public hearing came out on this particular section, it received support from our principals. And then, later on, for some reason, they changed their mind. And Mr. Chair, I watched the Guam Board of Directors meeting where two of our senators were in attendance. And I was listening to some of the principals who stood up and all of a sudden changed their mind that, oh, no, I don't know how to take care of this budget, the accounting from it should just be done by the superintendent, give it to this superintendent. And I'm thinking to my head, well, why would you say that when you don't need an accounting degree to realize that you have this amount of money that you expend? You definitely know how much money you spend for your power, your water, your personnel, any kind of improvements. In fact, this gives the opportunity for that individual principal to realize if there's any savings in their school, they actually can use that for capital improvements for their school. They might find out that the Agana Heights Elementary with let's just go to Antolon Middle School, where we know we have a lot of issues there on safety and the need for capital improvements. Where is Antolon? How come I can't find Antolon Middle School? Here we go. Antolon, there we go. Antolon Middle School, 7,261,427. And this principal works to keep cost measures in order to find ways to save money so that they can repair the bathroom, that they can put an awning out that's needed, that can make sure the facilities are safe, to fix those stairs when going up to one of the classrooms in the back area. So, Mr. Chair, this amendment just restores back what your intent was at the very beginning. It does not allow these principals to be accounting majors. This is still handled by central files. But now, Mr. Chair, we know how much money is going to these schools. And like I said before, in the event a particular school, Antolon Middle School, I went to Antolon Middle School. At that time, it was called Barragata Junior High. In the event that school does not are able to live within their 7,261,42 and they need additional money, that's when Central Files can come in and utilize any of their funds to help that school out. So, Mr. Chair, I humbly ask my colleagues to support this, to allow even our parents to keep an eye on the money that's given to their child's school, to ensure that goes directly to their child's school, that money. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Senator Tello. I'd ask the superintendent and also the oversight chair, Vice Speaker, if she would like to comment on the amendment. I'll start with the Vice Speaker first, then the superintendent may comment.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just so that the public is aware, there were some concerns, and I'd like to thank the superintendent and the board and the principals during that very productive meeting that we had in Central. Really, the intent is to ensure that each school received, that each principal was able to track an account for a certain amount of appropriation that they would get for their school. This is separate from the Principat Salape Principat. And so the concern was, we heard it during the public hearing and towards the beginning of the year, the principals came down and they gave their testimony, and we asked them, would you prefer this money going directly to the school? And some of them, you know, when these questions were asked, they said yes. And we even asked them, what are your top 3 capital improvement projects? How much is the cost? And so, you know, we went and visited a majority of our public schools, and we spoke with the principals about some of the challenges they have. And really, for me, it was not necessarily because I wanted to see why Department of Education was always getting short in appropriation, because I'm a teacher as well, and I know how hard it is to operate in the classroom, especially when you request supplies and they come 2 years after the date you requested them. It's already moot. And so really, to understand the inner workings of central, understand the inner workings of central operations at Department of Education takes a lot of time to get into the weeds of everything. And so really, some of the challenges is not that the appropriation is not there, but there are other priorities. There are other priorities perhaps that the board feels and the superintendent feels, and that's okay. That's their job to determine the priorities. That's why they're the leader of the agency. And so perhaps just this amendment is I think that is something that we can work towards. There was concerns that, and there was a lot of mixed messages and some misinformation given. The principals were under the impression that they had to provide the procurement resource themselves, that they had to account for every dollar themselves, that they had to find an additional body to be a finance accountant. And really, that's not the case. The case is that central operations is still there. So they have this data system that if a principal needs a capital improvement project, he or she goes into the software, she types it in, and then it's done. And then central operation prioritizes that in accordance with their selection criteria. And so what the principals felt was that they were going to do the work of central operations, which is not the case. However, this is something that we've been discussing with the board chair. Mr. Mendiola brought it up in one of our discussions before one of our informational hearings, and also with the superintendent, that this is something that we can look towards in the future so that there's no misinformation given, so that the principals know exactly the intent of the provision, because even you, Mr. Chair, were explaining, there was concerns about the authority of the superintendent, whether he can move the money around. And you said, no, the superintendent still has the authority, even with these provisions. And if there's an emergency, the superintendent still has the authority to move that money for the emergency. But this is, so I feel that we need to continue the community dialogue. We've already started that. Perhaps it was too quick on the button to execute. So since that missile has been discharged, we're doing some mitigation. So now, we don't want to launch another missile when we already know that we missed the objective. And so now we reshaped it to continue the appropriations as we traditionally did, but we are working with the superintendent and the board to move forward to see if we can make a provision very similar to this, if not the same, in the next fiscal year's appropriation, because we do want to see the principals and the schools get their own money, and if the principals agree with the superintendent agreeing, that the principals decide what their priority is, because PTOs are concerned the awnings are not being fixed, restrooms are inconsistent, et cetera, et cetera. And so I think we need to bring the community forward on this. Like I said, we were too quick to launch it, and sometimes we just need to pull back and mitigate and work with the community to bring it along. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Okay, thank you, Vice Speaker. Yep. Mr. Superintendent?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First of all, let me express thanks for our chairman, and as well as for Vice Speaker Nelson and also Senator Perez. We've had active discussions when it was first introduced, and then at the request of our Vice Speaker, we set up a meeting and invited all senators or their representatives to attend, and we also put it up on Facebook to provide anyone an opportunity to go back and check, or listen in on the meeting that we had. I want to thank the chairman and vice speaker as well for responding to the request to have those sections removed from the Appropriations Act, more or less based on the feedback that we got from our principals. So you cited JQ San Miguel as an example, and I would tell you that JQ San Miguel's administrator probably the most vocal against having this line item appropriation, probably without knowing what it really meant and how this would be operationalized. So it's not that it's necessarily, again, a bad idea or a bad intent to try to figure out how to ensure funding goes to the schools, but I think the mechanism and the timing for doing this, for implementing it during the middle of the school year, for not having buy-in from any of the administrators to figure out whether this was good or not so good for them in implementing their responsibilities. I agree with the Vice Speaker that more communication discussion is probably worth having on this subject, but at this point with regard to the budget, I requested that it be removed based on that feedback. And that's without going into some of the challenges and the implied issues that might come out of implementing the language as is. I do appreciate the focus and the issues especially related to our capital needs. I'm looking back at our request. We made a request for $21.1 million, Senator Taitegui, in this budget to cover the demolition of condemned structures, to classroom repairs, doors and window shutter repairs, flooring repairs, fencing repairs, roof leaks, renovations for restrooms, electrical upgrades, and so forth. And we realized the constraints on our financial resources, but as part of our budget process, we go out to every school and we collect their requests based on their meetings with their stakeholders. We bring that to the board, and then the board presents that to the legislature. And so even if we know that we're going to continue to try to work within our means, I want to make it very clear that the issues are visible and are out there for discussion. And I continue to implore you and your colleagues if you would help us to find a dedicated funding source to help address these issues and not be able to just band-aid them, because while I appreciate this discussion on the mediation money being moved, that's $21.1 million less $50,000, and we're going to have schools clamoring for the same commitment with regard to the rest of their needs. The only other comment, without getting into these items, is that our chairman, when he introduced the original Appropriations Act, and of course with his expertise as being a former board member and familiar with the schools, he introduced this with, I think, very good intent. But the challenge, and I mentioned this to him, was that recognizing that all of the agencies are not going to get what they want, and I think I've made it clear that DOE is dealing with a $19 million shortfall or reduction in our budgetary resources. And I think for the other agencies, I think the legislature, I would think, might be supporting the directors and being able to have the flexibility to manage within a much more difficult budget environment. And then at the same time with DOE, by taking this, this amendment would essentially, it looks like it would give the superintendent the opportunity to have, to be able to control 8 to 10% of the budget, and everything else would be allocated to the schools. So right now, if I looked at the audit report, our FY18 audit goes through how we expended our resources in the last fiscal year. Elementary education accounted for $81.1 million of our expenditures. Secondary education, $115.8 million. Direct student support, $74.5 million. And then general administration, $39.4 million. When you add those all up, it's basically, it looks like 87% of our resources were expended for the schools. And so if there's still greater concern about ensuring the transparency, I'm happy to work with our education chair to do that, and with our board. Our board does have the authority, once the appropriations are approved, to set the spending plan. So perhaps in that discussion with the board, we can continue this dialogue about how to ensure that the resources are maximized at the school level. Thank you.
Do we have any other questions from my colleagues? Senator Therese. This is, we're on the amendment. None. Any other questions by the members on the amendment? Senator Tello, if you can close, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Mr. Superintendent, for explaining that, you're going to work with the principals to let them know that this is what this really is all about. Because you mentioned the principal from JQ San Miguel, who's very vocal, who really didn't understand, and our good chair of education just mentioned that they didn't understand exactly that they're not the one that's going to have to do procurements or do any kind of accounting and stuff. But that's why I don't understand why you didn't explain it to your principals and let them know that what they feel that they have to do all this procurement and accounting was not the case at all.
Senator Tello, is that your closing?
I'm closing, yes, sir.
Okay, thank you.
I'm closing, sir. I'm closing. So, and that's just my point, that I'm trying to make here, is that if you're talking about trying to inform your principals, this is the opportunity. That was the opportunity when they had the public hearing almost a month ago, to inform your principals exactly what this meant. It didn't mean taking away what your responsibility is, Mr. Superintendent, but it is to allow this money to ensure that it goes to that particular school. And I understand that you said, and what harm is it? That's what I don't understand. What harm is it to do this? So you also mentioned that you're going to be working, with the oversight chair and the board. What about the parents? Are you going to keep them in the loop of every school? And if you're not, I ask that you include the parents to let them know that how much that you've appropriated or allocated for their particular school, so they can keep an eye on it too. So that, Mr. Chair, again, There's no harm in what we're doing here at all. It just gives the opportunity for principals to see how much they have, and actually to allow them not only to live within their means, but in the event to try and save some money so they can make their own repairs to their schools, to report back to their parents, to let them know what they've done, to cut costs and to make improvements to their school. That's why we have parent-teacher conference, PTOs, for all these schools, so they can continue to be involved. This is one way they can do that. So I humbly ask my colleagues to please support this amendment.
Thank you, Senator Tello. On the amendment, are there any objections? There's an objection. All in favor of the amendment, please raise your right hand. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Motion fails. Do we have any other questions for education? Does any of my colleagues have any other questions so we can move along? Ma'am, you have a question?
Just one
please?
question while the
Thank you.
superintendent's here. Thank you. I just wanted to, in the news recently, they've announced that your chief financial officer is maybe leaving, but I wanted to find out the progress of the third-party recipient, or the third-party, where I know you've been paying, and how much of your budget right now is going to that, and she gave us a lot of hope that you would be getting out of that soon. So I just want to know, is that possible this fiscal year? Would you?
We're very hopeful. So when you're talking about the FY 2020, we're hopeful. I think, first of all, let me just confirm the fact that our Deputy Superintendent, Taling Taitano, who has been with us, I think going into her 10th year, was recently announced that she will be departing to one of our autonomous agencies, the Waterworks Authority, as their new Chief Financial Officer. And I wanted to just recognize her and congratulate her before this body, because she has been doing a lot of work to drive the financial improvements. And because of the work that she's done, we believe that we will still make progress as those people she's worked with continue to work in the department. If I could, I know we'll make a more formal announcement later on, but I did want to share on the way down to the legislature, we received a correspondence from the U.S. Department of Education that of the 7 conditions, we had 3 already removed. They just today approved the removal of the 4th one. So that goes from 7 special conditions down to 3. And so if you're asking if we're making progress, the answer is yes. And now it's documented. Now it's something that we can share with you, and we will definitely forward that to our education chair. It was on the way down right outside when I received that correspondence. So I do want to say yes, that's possible. We paid $2.5 million for the third-party fiduciary agent. It is down from where it used to be early on in the contract, around $4 to $5 million, and we've steadily been trying to reduce it. But the goal is to remove the third-party fiduciary agent with USDOE's approval. Our current plan, which is the roadmap to get the USDOE's final review and approval, our roadmap brings us to the end of December. Now the timeframes may fluctuate a little bit depending on the issue, but that's generally the goal line, end of December. Now that would mean that USDOE would then come and review, and if they give us a good review and approval, then we'll lay out the process for then removing the special conditions and the requirement for a third party. So if it happens this fiscal year, I would definitely be happy, and that's our goal.
That's fantastic news, and I hope that happens. That's great news, and that would free up $2.5 million, hopefully, very soon for putting back into DOE or Simon Sanchez. Thank you, Mr. Superintendent.
Thank you, Senator Reese. Does any of my colleagues have any questions? Vice Speaker?
Sorry, Mr. Chair, thank you. Just real quick, because there was a concern brought up on the textbooks. There's concern that about adding the charter schools into the law, and so we are trying to include them under the charter school provision. Just want to get your piece, Mr. Superintendent, because you're also working with the private schools, if all three can come together and so that we can include the charter school students to get textbooks as well.
Oh, if I just want to comment, I could comment on that. We do have some things to iron out for sure when it comes to the charter schools, but I do want to thank the legislature for moving in this direction that we requested this whole time, which was to separate the entities from the Charter School Council and the charter schools from the Guam Education Board and Guam Department of Education. I say that because while I recognize the intent, our role in reviewing the invoices of entities that we don't have control over kind of harmed the relationship in some ways. I mean, I think, meaning the only times we would engage is when we dispute an invoice. I do think there are a lot of other ways to collaborate, and we're happy to work on those issues regarding textbooks. Right now, it's just a matter of clarifying some of the laws and statutes out there. I don't think we want to move forward because we've learned our lessons, move forward without the authority and the clarity that we need. So when it comes to textbooks, that's all we're asking from the legislature.
Yes, so for now, we're including them in the budget bill so that for the fiscal year, and then we are doing an amendment to 17 GCA Chapter 4 for the curriculum and text to include them as well.
Thank you. No further questions from my, is this in reference to education?
Well, that's my point of information, Mr. Chair. Is this just for DOE?
We're only talking about DOE.
Just part one?
We're only on
Okay.
DOE. Is there any questions specifically to DOE? Yes, Senator Kelly.
Situus Masi. And following up on a conversation I was able to have with the superintendent during one of our recesses, a point that we were discussing, as many people have discussed, looking for a high school design so that we're not reinventing the wheel every time. And so I, apparently among many others, had asked whether JFK or other schools for high school were built in that design build model. And so the clarification was that they indeed were. So the point of information before I get into my questions is that it became apparent that separating out the design for Simon Sanchez has a lot of potential. It gives us finally a design that we will own for a high school. And so going forward, this may end up being a cost-saving measure. And so I think that's very important for us to understand that once we have this and we own this design, that we may be able to use it again should the need arise for, let's say, maybe a junior high or a further high school. So I just thought that was an important consideration amongst everything that we had talked about, and something perhaps to keep in mind that while working on Simon Sanchez, that this may end up being a model for others. And if that needs to come into the conversation or just into the thought process, that might be helpful. So regarding the textbooks, I just want to understand this a little bit better. They are being given to private schools already, so there's already a process in place. And then what we'll be needing to figure out at some point is how this will or won't apply for charter schools, although charter schools are public schools, so it makes sense that we should be accommodating textbooks in one way or another. What is the formula that GDOE has, or the process, in providing textbooks to private schools?
So basically, based on the amount appropriated, we then would allocate based on enrollment. So the share of the textbook funding would be allocated based on enrollment. And of course, it depends on the textbooks that are approved and that are being requested. But that's, yeah, so typically we have a process to go and review and approve textbooks with our board before we allocate them. I think I mentioned, and as I mentioned I think I mentioned to the senator that one of the tricky parts is, in addition to the allocation, is that the language has recently been expanded to include instructional supplies and materials, supplementary in nature. So that's something that we should keep in mind, that there's a textbook process as well as, I'm sure, requests for other types of materials that were still, recently was enacted, so we've been working through that with our partners. When it comes to the charter schools, like I'd say, we are engaged with one of the charter schools and with our legal teams just to clarify this. But the biggest issue that arose was really a lack of clarity and on the intention of that language as it relates to charter schools and DOE and the private schools. I don't think there's any objection in policy, but to work out whether or not the textbooks were incorporated into their funding formula, and if separate, were they intended to be funded by the textbook fund, and those are the things that we're hoping to work out and resolve.
Sujus Masi for that. It's important that we are providing textbooks, but it's true we need to have due diligence to understand the per pupil cost so that we aren't inadvertently paying for them twice. Like, just to be making clear, we do need to understand that. So with that formula and reviewing the textbooks and so forth, with that allocation, is that a pretty straightforward formula that for private schools there's a certain amount per pupil that's typically or traditionally applied?
So the issue with the textbooks has not, I mean, with the private school, hasn't really been the formula. It's really been the amount of money available for textbooks. So I think, as you know, when we request for all the textbooks to meet the mandate, we're talking about upwards of $15 million to meet all the backlog in textbook requests. I think for our purposes, the issue we had with, we have with the charter schools right now is not necessarily the allocation and the requests that are being made. The question that was brought to our attention internally was whether we needed the board to approve it as part of the process. And that's the only kind of initial issue that was raised internally that we're trying to just clarify. But I think the effort is to try to clarify it and make sure that we're all, if we're giving, I think I agree with the point that if we're funding private school textbooks, charter schools need to be addressed in that same, concept, with that same concept of funding, textbooks for all children. The question is making sure that the laws are clear on it.
Sujus Masi. So I'll just ask quickly, so conversely, going in the other direction for GDOE, is there a formula for the cost of textbooks per student, or is it very specific based on the subjects and so forth?
Yeah, I believe that these decisions are made in the joint curriculum committee between the union and management representatives. So what they will do is, in line with the curriculum and in line with the standards that have been adopted, review and recommend textbooks for purchase. And then, based on the request and the need that's demonstrated, we'll go to the board to have that textbook approved. And then, when we have the opportunity to fund those textbooks, we'll make those orders. An additional challenge of textbooks, which I'm glad for the language that was adjusted in this Appropriations Act to reflect prior acts, is that due to historic relationships or issues with the vendors, we typically have to prepay the vendors before we're able to get those books sent. So typically we have to make sure that cash available, pay the vendor, and that was there when I came in, but apparently in response to prior issues of non-payment or inability to pay in a timely manner.
Thank you, Senator Kelly. Is there any other questions for the Department of Education? There being none, the Department of Education on that chapter is closed. We will now move to page 18, the Guam Academy Charter School Council. Senator Nelson, do you have an amendment? Let's take a quick recess so we can have the superintendent and his staff depart. We're back from recess. We will recess, as requested by my colleagues, until 1:30.